So let's start the introductions, and hopefully more people will meander in by the time we get done introducing Michael fulsomely. I'm Neil O'Muraku. I'm the faculty coordinator of the World Issues Forum at Fairhaven College, and I organize this forum with April Hinkle-Johnson, our events coordinator, and Mark Miller, our media manager. And Mark is sort of being our Zoom godfather this afternoon. In a moment, I'm going to invite Dr. Laurie Troutman to introduce our program and our speaker, Michael O'Shea, from the University of Toronto, presently based in Boston. Before that, I just want to do a quick plug for next week's World Issues Forum, which is our final forum of the year. And that is taking place. We've moved that because Fairhaven is having Scholars Day on the 18th. We have decided to hold the final forum, which is when the students who were on the Adventure Learning Grant in 2021-2022 in various countries in the Balkans and Portugal and Spain will be talking about their experiential learning internationally. So we'll have three students: Jordan Carey, Bella Milliken, and Carly Hager. Yeah, so please join us one day late at 12 o'clock on and half an hour later than usual for on Scholars Day, which is Thursday the 18th. And I'm going to hand over to Laurie, but just note that the World Issues Forum is Western's Global Justice Speaker Series, which has been going on since 2001. Started at that time. So Dr. Troutman's going to introduce today's speaker on our program. So thank you so much, Laurie.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the World Issues Forum. I'd like to start by acknowledging that Western Washington University resides on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Lummi people and the Nooksack tribe. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Michael O'Shea. Michael is an education practitioner and scholar and a PhD candidate studying under Dr. Stephanie Waterman of the Onondaga Turtle Clan at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. His research explores how Canadian universities can act on their historic Jay Treaty obligations to better support Indigenous students across the US-Canada border. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Student Award and a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Graduate Award for his research. He currently works as early college program manager in Cambridge, Massachusetts, strengthening academic pathways between high school and university. And part of the reason Michael is speaking at the World Issues Forum today is that he is one of the Border Policy Research Institute's cross-border visiting scholars. The Cross-Border Visiting Scholars Program is a partnership between BPRI and the University of Victoria's Borders and Globalization Program. And it allows us to bring both border scholars and also practitioners from all over the world to our cross-border region to learn about how things work here, and also provides us an opportunity, of course, to learn from these scholars and the places that they come from and the topics that they study. Our other cross-border visiting fellow this year was Andrzej Jakubowski, who gave the first World Issues Forum talk in fall quarter. You may have heard that. He spoke on dynamics at the Polish-Ukrainian border. So I'll now turn it over to Michael. I think you're very much going to enjoy his talk on the Jay Treaty and opportunities to create more Indigenous student mobility across the Canada-US border.
Wow, that was quite the introduction, Dr. Troutman. I will try and live up to all of that. So good to see everyone here. Sorry I can't be there in person. We're welcoming our first child later this week, so I need to be on standby in the event of a late night drive to the hospital. So in true academic fashion, I'm going to take a second to share my screen, as they say. Can everyone see that? Tremendous. So as Dr. Troutman mentioned, I'm a cross-border fellow. I feel very lucky to be in this role. Had the pleasure of meeting the great folks at Western Washington University, as well as a great team up at University of Victoria. So I have so many people to thank at Western Washington and the University of Victoria. So today we're going to talk about the Jay Treaty. So by the end of today, I hope that you know what the Jay Treaty is, why it matters, what universities are doing, and what more could they do. I'm sorry that the Native American Student Union wasn't able to make it today. I had a great conversation with that group when I was out at the university last week, but I want to plug their efforts at advocating for tuition waivers in the state of Washington. Here's what we're gonna talk about today, folks. So background on the Jay Treaty, methods of my research, both for my dissertation and my fellowship. They build on each other. Some results with some new updates, some maps and surveys. So stay tuned, Lori. As well as some analysis and some conclusion. Also some activities. Zoom can get boring. Lecturing can be boring. So there's going to be some fun activities. Hopefully that doesn't make you cringe, but just a chance to engage and reflect a little bit about the Jay Treaty, and if you're part of a university, what your institution might be doing or not doing around the Jay Treaty. Neil, quick favor. Do you mind checking the chat box if I'm not, I don't think I'm able to see it. In case folks leave comments in there.
Okay, I will monitor the chat box, Michael.
That would be great. That'd be great. Please take breaks as needed. If there's a burning question or comment or critique, feel free to let me know. And if there are any accessibility questions or comments that we haven't taken care of, please let me or the organizers know. Where possible, I've included alt text for each of the images. So who am I? How did I come to do this work? I'm not Indigenous. I am an Irish American settler living in what is now Cambridge, Massachusetts, homelands and unceded territory of the Massachusetts. Also home now to Indigenous folks from across Turtle Island being an Indigenous term that's sometimes used for the continent of North America. So that's who I am. And maybe I can advance the screen here. There we go. So that's me. But who else is in the room? So I know Neil and Lori and Jennifer, it's great to see you. Thanks for having me. But if you feel comfortable, I'd love to just hear who else is in the room. So you can put your name in the chat, where you're dialing in from, what Indigenous territories you're currently on. And if you need a guide, the website nativelands.ca, it's imperfect, but it's a start. If you don't know what Indigenous territories you're on, to start that learning journey. Great. Well, it's great to see you all. So my Jay Treaty journey started about 10 years ago. It started when I was working in Canada, or the territories claimed by Canada. I'll refer to as Canada for shorthand later on. The same goes for the United States. It started about 10 years ago when, as part of my work as an international student recruiter with a program called Education USA, a State Department program, I visited a First Nations school outside Winnipeg called Children of the Earth School. I also visited the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, where I got this very cool pin. And when I was there, I got questions about the Jay Treaty. So I was representing the US government. I was an education advisor. So I got very reasonably questions. Well, what does the Jay Treaty mean if I'm an Indigenous student who wants to study across the border? Do I need a visa? Do I get in-state tuition or international tuition? And quite simply, I didn't know. So I went back to my office, thought the question should be straightforward, yes or no. But like a lot of things, it was more complicated than I originally thought. And I've spent the last 10 years trying to really give that classroom that first asked me, those teachers, those students, a good answer. And I'm still working on it. So this research took me to my master's program. Some of my classmates there are in the upper right. and then later to U of T in Toronto, where I'm doing my PhD. And I've had the chance to be part of some other conversations, like the treaties talk, and creating some other deliverables like a policy brief around this topic. My day job, when I'm not wearing my PhD hat, I work in Cambridge Public Schools as a early college manager. So I'm interested in the Jay Treaty, but I'm also interested and passionate about student affairs and making sure that students are successful and that we're pulling down historic and contemporary barriers to student success. Which ties in pretty nicely to questions about, well, why am I doing this, right? Why does this matter? One is that Indigenous students are underserved, underrepresented in higher ed. Higher ed is often colonial in nature, colonizing in nature, and hostile to Indigenous students. So there's a chance here for universities in Canada and also in the US to do better, right? To do better and to recognize the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty, which dates to 1794, is not recognized in Canada and is only partially recognized in the US. Universities occupy and profit from occupying Indigenous lands. And so tuition waivers, which we'll explain in a second, is one application of the Jay Treaty, is, I would say, the least that universities could do. Education is also part of historic treaty agreements that are gone unacknowledged. And finally, as some contemporary Native scholars have pointed out, financial aid and higher education is part of Indigenous nation building and sovereignty. So that quote at the top, for example, I think says it pretty succinctly. Financial aid for Native students contributes to Native student nation building. Okay. In the States, there's a movement, this is related, around tuition waivers. So, for example, the California the California University System, University of Illinois in Chicago, they are recognizing now any Indigenous student from territories claimed by the United States as in-state students, so not charging them out-of-state tuition. There are caveats to that, of course, in that in the case of UIC, for example, the student would need to be a member of a federally recognized tribe. And there are a lot of issues around that. The Native American Student Union, they also told me that they were down in Olympia, the capital of Washington, lobbying for a more expansive view of eligibility for in-state tuition waivers. So that hopefully one day any Indigenous student attending a university or a higher ed institution in the state of Washington would get an in-state tuition waiver. All right. I said there'd be an activity. Here's an activity. Choose one of the following statements. I know a lot about the Jay Treaty. I think I have an average amount of knowledge of the Jay Treaty. I know a little about the Jay Treaty, and I'm not sure about the Jay Treaty. So what is your knowledge of the Jay Treaty? And let's see here. Learning more from you every day. I know it exists. Okay, this is a good start. And I know I've had some conversations in person about this with you. So I'm glad we have some 2s, 3s, and 4s. So there's a reason for me being here today. So we could spend a whole hour talking about the Jay Treaty. There's a lot to it in terms of history, politics, American history, formation of American political parties. But what interests me here is one article of it, Article 3. The Jay Treaty was signed between the United States and Great Britain in 1794 to 1795. It took 2 years because communication was a little slower back then. It was meant to avoid another outbreak of war between Great Britain and the US. And within that was Article 3. And Article 3 is pretty important. You'll see why. So I'll read part of it aloud, which is, it is agreed that the quote, Indians, it's the language of the treaty at the time, dwelling on either side of the border. So whatever border crops up between the US and British North America, later Canada, Indigenous peoples will have the right to freely pass and repass across that border. And There'll be no imposition of goods. So nothing that would inhibit commerce or trade across the border. For the historians in the room, that's what the original treaty looks like. The treaty, though, is only sort of partially recognized in the US today. The right of entry is recognized, not the right to do commerce. So duties would be imposed. The right to commerce is still restricted. So what does that mean today that the right of entry is recognized? It means that according to statutory law in the US, as of 1952, a native person who can prove 50% blood quantum, so half indigenous by bloodline, has the right to live, work, and study in the US. They don't need a green card. They don't need a work visa. They don't need a student visa. The blood quantum is challenging. It's racist. So there are a lot of issues around that as well. There is a push in Congress right now from indigenous lawyers to have that blood quantum language removed. So the educator in me, when I see this, thinks, so that this means that an indigenous student would not, from the other side of the border in Canada, would not be considered an international student, right? So what are the ramifications of that for higher ed and for student access, right? The other side of the coin, it's not recognized at all in Canada. Canada would claim that there was no legislation that went along to implement the treaty. And besides, it was Great Britain who signed it. We didn't. Even though under the British North America Act, Canadian Parliament inherited the responsibilities of Britain towards and its relations with Indigenous peoples. But we'll ignore that for now. Supreme Court in Canada has ruled at least twice that the Jay Treaty does not apply. 1956 and again in 2001. This is based on a Western view of treaty as contractual, as time-bound, versus an indigenous view of treaty as sacred, as based on a relationship, and as long-lasting. You really want to dig into the Jay Treaty dates, we can talk later. These are some important dates in the timeline of the Jay Treaty. And I'm going back to 1613, where we can see the Jay Treaty as part of the hundreds of other treaties and diplomatic agreements between settler countries like the Netherlands, like Great Britain, and indigenous sovereign nations on Turtle Island. All right, so that's the legal background, but I'm not a lawyer, right? I'm not a historian, I'm an educator. So let's bring this up to an education field, okay? So my research is positioned, as those three circles show, at the intersection of Indigenous higher ed, law, and the history of this continent. And as I'm doing this research, I'm keeping in mind what's called the 5 R's of Indigenous research, which is to be respectful, make sure the research is relevant, engage in reciprocal relationships, recognize the responsibility of doing this work, and maintain relationships. My research has changed over time. So back in 2014, that was my research question. Today, in 2022, it's how do Canadian universities honor the Jay Treaty? And then thanks to this fellowship, so thank you so much to my hosts out west, I was able to dig a little deeper and look at how Canadian universities and US universities in the Cascadia region are honoring the Jay Treaty. I really dug deep into two schools, which is University of Saskatchewan in 2017 and Vancouver Island University in 2018. I'll let you think about why those dates are important and what was happening during that time. That's the location of those two schools, which are on Indigenous homelands. There were some sub-questions. You can read that for yourself up there. But I'm broadly interested in why are schools choosing to recognize the Jay Treaty, and why now? Why 225 years after the Jay Treaty are they recognizing it? And also, what does recognizing look like? Universities are not federal governments. They can't change immigration law. this treaty seems to be about migration or immigration. So what can they do? Stay tuned. As I'm going through this, I'm thinking a lot about myself as a settler in relation to Indigenous students, Indigenous communities, my advisor who is Indigenous, and I'm using a polishing the chain framework. So maybe you've heard of this framework, but it derives from the Truro Wampum, which is a diplomatic agreement and treaty that dates back between the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy and the first Dutch settlers on the continent. The purple rose on the wampum symbolize the two ways of life, an Indigenous way of life and a settler or Dutch way of life, and an agreement to non-interference and mutual respect. Of course, the Dutch and later England, Britain would not uphold this agreement, and there was not a pattern of mutual respect or mutual understanding. But that's the framework that I'm coming from. Okay, so there's two ways of life: an Indigenous way of life and a Dutch or settler way of life, and that can be represented by a canoe and a ship. Okay, and connecting those two vessels is a chain, and this chain, depending on the account, might represent friendship. Here, I'll jump ahead to this slide. Represents mutual friendship, good minds, and everlasting peace. Okay. This chain, though, the parties to this agreement recognize that that chain might tarnish over time, right? So this relationship might need to be revisited or renewed. And the metaphor for that is this polishing of the chain. The silver chain will tarnish, and the chain will need to be polished and renewed. That's how I'm thinking about these Jay Treaty policies as universities choose to act on their Jay Treaty responsibility as a polishing of the chain. So revisiting their historic treaty responsibilities that have been ignored for over 2 centuries. And thinking about my responsibility as a settler. So it puts me in this relationship as well. So if you're an academic, you'll want to know what my methods were. So that up top is my framework in blue. Orange are my methods. My dissertation methods are in black and in red. So semi-structured interviews with administrators at US and Canadian universities. Some document analysis, board meeting notes, for example. And then thanks to the fellowship, I was able to do surveys of universities, as well as some really interesting mapping. So I'll report on both sets of those results. Are there any qualitative researchers in the room? Well, if there are, you'll be interested maybe in my qualitative thematic analysis of the interviews, which I transcribed, and my document analysis. So I'm going through my documents, my interview transcripts, and coding them, putting in codes, and then looking at those codes for themes that emerge. Okay, I'll take a pause right here if folks have any questions or need to take a glass of water or a bio break.
I was just curious, and I put this in the chat, but in your survey of administrators, do you think that Canadian administrators or US administrators are more receptive to talking to you about their research?
That's interesting. And I'll say I started with Canadian universities because there were more Canadian schools that mentioned the Jay Treaty specifically on their websites. And so that was my starting point. I do think that the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, I think have established a context or a bit of base knowledge in the minds of settler administrators, at least. So that when I did reach out, I think in their minds, I wasn't coming out of left field. Anecdotally, I'm finding among US administrators that my Jay Treaty questions do seem sort of out of left field to some administrators. So I don't know. I think both sides of the border, schools were equally receptive, but there was a bit maybe more of a context or understanding of why I might be asking this question on the Canadian side of the border.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, Neil has told me I need to be done by within 60 minutes, so I'm going to keep going, okay? All right, let's dig into results and analysis. So my starting point was University of Saskatchewan and Vancouver Island University. These schools passed their policies, their Jay Treaty policies in 2017 and 2018, respectively. If you're not familiar with Vancouver Island University, it's just across the waters for those of you out in Bellingham. Started off as a college, Malaspina College, became a university in 2008. It has 3 campuses and a center, of course, all on Indigenous land. And it reports that its Indigenous student body is 11% of total enrollment. Okay. Going east, different territories, different landscape, different climate in Saskatoon, where the University of Saskatchewan is located. This is a medical comprehensive research university founded in 1907. It's a little bit different of an institution than Vancouver Island University. It's located on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis, bigger than VIU, but reports an equal number of Indigenous students as a percentage of its student body. And please take those stats about Indigenous student enrollment with a whole ton of salt. They are famously problematic, those reports of Indigenous students. Just keep that in mind. Okay. All right, so hopefully you like interaction. If you don't, you can turn your cameras off now, but hopefully you do. Activity 3, let's look at some documents together. So this was kind of early days for my research, where I went onto the website of Vancouver Island University and I looked at their tuition policy regarding the Jay Treaty. So let's look at this together. And you can even pull it up on your computer using the URL at the bottom. So they say they recognize the Jay Treaty. And this page was put up after their Board of Governors passed this Jay Treaty tuition adjustment. So what jumps out at you? Feel free to put a note in the chat. Or what do you notice about this document? All right, I'll go first. So you'll see in green, there's a comment about eligibility. So Vancouver Island University is excited to welcome students living outside of Canada with an ancestral connection to Canadian Indigenous groups to study at the lower domestic tuition rate. So there's 2 things there that I think are interesting. One is the lower domestic tuition rate. So they're not going to charge a student who's from Lummi Nation, for example, from across the water, across the US-Canada border. They're not going to charge them international student tuition, okay? They're also going to extend eligibility to students who have an ancestral connection to an Indigenous group on the Canadian side. And you can see how that could raise some questions, right? Or how would you prove eligibility for that? What's interesting to me too is that just above that language, they have a link to a Jay Treaty letter of support template. So at VIU, if you think you're a student who's eligible, you would download that letter of support, have the local First Nation, say one that's near VIU's campus, and basically have this First Nation vouch for you. Okay. All right, so let's look at University of Saskatchewan, because they're a little bit different. Maybe you'll have some thoughts on this. So this is their website, put up in, I think, 2017, 2018. So off the bat, University of Saskatchewan honors the Jay Treaty of 1794, which provides the free passage of First Nations and Native American citizens across the United States border. Okay, so again, there's the waiver of international student tuition. They're still paying tuition, it's just not international student rate. But then let's look at eligibility. So Neil, I'm going to put you on the spot here. what do you notice about eligibility or documentation? And hint, it's in blue or pink.
You still need, did you say blue? I was looking at the pink, you know?
Yeah, blue or pink.
You still need federal enrollment or registration. I think similar documentation perhaps could be interesting. That might open possibilities depending on the interpretation or the application of the policy.
Yeah. And then thanks so much for that. And then Jennifer says needs a registration card. Okay. So a little bit different, right? The first example at VIU, you got a local First Nation to vouch for you. Here, they want a federal tribal enrollment card. What if you're not in a federally recognized tribe as recognized by the US government? So different kinds of eligibility, different universities are going to ask for different things. They're going to interpret it differently. They're not a one size fits all model, but it's just interesting how different schools are implementing this, right? Any other comments before I move on? No, okay. So here are the two schools side by side. And I alluded to some of these features in the last couple minutes. Eligibility is a bit different, proving it's a little bit different, but similarity in terms of who passed it. So thinking about higher ed governance, it's the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors is charged with any financial adjustments, any tuition adjustments, okay? And uptake, what do we see here? So 0 students at VIU have accessed the policy. There may have been 1 or 2 since I wrote this slide, but it's very few. And then 10 at University of Saskatchewan. So I would say it's a big deal symbolically, this policy, but not a lot of students are accessing it. Why is that? Let's keep that in mind.
Why do you think that is, or are you getting to that?
Yeah, in case I forget, I'll give you a sneak peek. So I've heard it hasn't really been a part of recruitment efforts yet at either school. At University of Saskatchewan, the US market is not one of their big international student markets. So they just haven't done a lot of recruitment on the other side of the border, right? I have heard though that I think they are going to do more recruitment on the US side of the border. And when they do, they'll make the Jay Treaty part of that recruitment. So that's one reason, is just simply advertising. It hasn't been promoted very much. And I think for a student, a question might be, all right, well, why would I make this journey, go through this trouble of going to a school on the other side of the border if there's schools on this side of the border? So that's something I haven't really dug into, but it's on my mind. If you love policy like I do, this is a policy map I developed. Briefly, this Jay Treaty policy at both schools started with Indigenous advocacy. So students asked about it, staff asked about it, in the decades before the policy was officially passed. Okay, so students ask about it, they introduce this nugget, right, into university governance, it becomes talked about, senior university leadership gets involved, the policy gets on the path to being officially adopted. There's input, continued advocacy from Indigenous staff, students. For example, the Indigenous Teacher Education Program at University of Saskatchewan was very involved in pushing for this policy. And then there's constant consultation going on. But where rubber really hits the road is when the motion is officially introduced to the Board of Governors and it's passed. It's adopted. In the case of VIU, it was adopted unanimously in I think about 10 minutes. And then it's up to the registrar, one of the unsung heroes of this process, to implement it. So if there's any registrars on this call, I have great respect for you. Having to implement very lofty, well-intentioned vision to policy and writing the text for the website. All right, so I've got about 13 minutes left. I'm gonna go into a little deeper into results. With Heather rejoining us here. All right, see, there's some prominent interview themes. I dug into the motivations. I was really curious to understand why universities decided to act at this moment, and especially why and how settlers, right? So non-Indigenous folks who were many of the senior administrators, how they felt about this, and how, to use my original framework, how they felt like they were in relationship and how they were upholding treaty responsibility. So briefly, some interview themes were Indigenous advocacy. So it's wonderful these schools are acting on this, but this is only after centuries and decades of Indigenous advocacy around it. The second is institutional autonomy. So if anyone cares about governance here, these schools are able to adopt these policies because they can set or waive international student fees. They cannot adjust a student's immigration status. Then there's different roles, right? There's roles for Indigenous staff, president, registrar, board of governors, different motivations. The context around the policy matters, especially time. Why is this happening in post 2015? I mentioned the TRC calls to action. This could be one reason why this is all happening now. Then there's the impact. So there's the symbolic significance, but what does it mean for students if there aren't too many students accessing the policies? Which gets to my other question about, well, what does success look like? So I'm going to put up a few word bubbles here. I, of course, can't read all of them. Feel free to read them while I'm talking through them. And I'll just choose one maybe for each slide in the interest of time. So at VIU, the board passed this policy unanimously in about 10 minutes. So much quicker than I thought. The board minutes were pretty straightforward. There wasn't a lot of back and forth. So there was a lot of agenda setting by the president beforehand to make sure this passed smoothly. And then there was, again, this advocacy ahead of time from students who asked about the policy and First Nations, right, who gave their input on the policy. Institutional autonomy. This is from an administrator at VIU. So this gets to the point that universities can't adjust a student's immigration status. They can adjust their tuition status, but not their immigration status. This quote in blue down here, this is what really got the ball rolling at VIU. There was a student from the Southwest who asked about the policy. This was like 16, 17 years ago. The university moved to grant that student a one-off tuition adjustment in recognition of their Jay Treaty rights, but it didn't become official policy. And this is often the case in universities. There might be a one-off of internal policy before it becomes a formal policy. And they elaborate on that in the blue bubble up here. Okay. Has anyone heard of Paul Daibo? He's very important to the story of the Jay Treaty. All right, I'm going to take that silence as a no, or maybe you've heard about him, but you want to hear me talk about it, which is fine too. So I bring this up because this is one of the many instances of Indigenous advocacy for their Jay Treaty rights. And yes, Heather, exactly. In the decades and centuries before higher ed responds. So lawyers in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, but this establishes or sets up the Supreme Court ruling in the US that recognizes the right of free passage of Indigenous, well, in the case of Paul Daibo, an Indigenous worker who was working in the US or on the US side of the border. So the case, he was a Mohawk iron worker, one of many Mohawk iron workers who continued to build skyscrapers across North America, who was facing deportation from Philadelphia. It was alleged he was an illegal alien. He had no right to work in the US. This is a time of tightening border restrictions in the US. There's imposition of quotas in the 1920s. So Paul Daibo was, is threatened with deportation. He launches a lawsuit with support of lawyers and his supporters, and he wins. He says that, rightly so, that through his Jay Treaty rights, he has the right to work in the United States. And that led to a Supreme Court case later in the 1920s. Back to the Mohawks. The Mohawks are among the most active advocates around the Jay Treaty. This is a wonderful film, powerful film. If you haven't watched it already, from 1969, called "You Are on Indian Land," directed and featuring Michael Mitchell, later Grand Chief. And this is about Mohawk activist protests of Canadian levies on cross-border goods and the presence of a Canadian customs house on the Akwesasne Reserve or reservation. So again, these are just two examples of this long history of Indigenous advocacy around the Jay Treaty before it gets to the Board of Governors at VIU or University of Saskatchewan. Okay, context matters. Both these schools report higher percentage of Indigenous students at their schools than the rest of schools in Canada, above the average, which would mean that perhaps there's more of an incentive, there's more maybe pressure to adopt these sorts of policies. And there's also Indigenous populations in and around these universities. I talked about the registrar being an unsung hero here. Registrars were often my first point of contact. Jennifer, you asked if schools were receptive to me. If they were receptive, it was often the registrar getting back to me. So I'm going to jump ahead to some of the work from my fellowship, since we have sponsors from my fellowship on the call here. And I want to get into my survey results. So this was a complement to my interviews, where I sent out a survey to schools across North America about their Jay Treaty policies to see what they had. And I heard back from 21 schools in Canada. Of them, 6 schools had Jay Treaty policies on the books. And there were a few that had internal policies, a one-off policy, so like Royal Roads, University of Fraser Valley, and other schools had these policies in progress. So as we speak, I believe UNBC in Northern British Columbia is considering a policy. I also, through research, found that there are schools that mention the Jay Treaty. I don't know if they're enrolling any students to the Jay Treaty, but who have Jay Treaty policies on the books in some form, including Queens College in City University of New York. I wonder why that school. Northwest Indian College has it on the books. It's written, it's on their website. And then University of Maine and University of Minnesota Morris, they have sort of a version of a cross-border tuition waiver for Indigenous students coming from the other side of the border, but which doesn't explicitly mention the Jay Treaty. So that's sort of another flavor of policies that I'm seeing. And you see it in some of the Canadian schools too. So at Manitoba, there's a similar setup. All right, so moving on to maps. Everyone loves a good map here. This is a work in progress, but if you'd like to check out the draft version, you can scan that QR code with your phone. You can visit the website, and I'm mapping some of my survey results and my research results, because I'm interested in any spatial patterns that emerge or spatial relationships. On this map, in green are schools that have a Jay Treaty policy. Those in red do not have a policy. Those in orange have an internal policy that's not public. And those in gray, which are most of the thousands of schools in North America, don't have a Jay Treaty policy on the books. But I think it's interesting thinking about how far are the schools from the border that have these policies? And how would you get to these schools? So I'm zooming in on Cascadia here, and I added to the map ferry routes, ferry crossings, and border checkpoints. So say you were from Lummi and you wanted to go to University of Victoria. They have a great program in Indigenous law or governance. How would you get there? Could you take a ferry? Would you drive around? I learned when I was out in Bellingham, there's no direct ferry to Vancouver Island. You would have to drive north or south to take a ferry. So This is a work in progress, but I'm interested in how these policies, if we think about student access, that also includes physical access. So how would a student who is eligible for this policy, as restrictive as that is, how would they physically get to the university? So to be continued, but please check out the website there. I would love it if anyone on the call works at a university that I haven't surveyed, to take this survey or to pass it on to your registrar. So another fun QR code scanning activity there. All right, so let's bring it home in these last few minutes. So stepping back here, I'm thinking about, why is this happening? Why in this moment? And I would say a lot of it is interest convergence. And this is a concept that comes from the civil rights era in the United States, which is, why does the US act on racial segregation in schools in the Cold War era? And that's because not simply the US government had a change of heart and decided to do good on racial justice, but also because there was an imperative. There was a benefit for the US government to strike down racial segregation because it would improve the US reputation abroad when there was a struggle for ideas and power with the USSR during the Cold War. And so there could be a similar interest convergence around schools who are passing Jay Treaty policies. I'm not saying this is the whole situation, but I think it's a useful framing to think about, well, there's pressure on schools right now to do something around reconciliation or decolonization. This might be, to not be crass, an easy win, or something that's relatively easy to pass, versus, say, revamping the entire curriculum to make it less colonizing. And then to couch this in the historic treaty framework relationship of polishing the chain, I really like the polishing the chain framework because it puts everyone in relationship. It's not one party acting on the other, it's parties in relationship determining policies at their institution. So we have Indigenous folks acting on settler folks at the institution to act on this. Settler folks are learning about treaty relationships and learning about the moral imperative of taking action, and they're helping pass some of this through Board of Governors. One question I have, though, is what does it mean for schools that aren't acting on the Jay Treaty? This would mean that one party, i.e. the settler institution, has not polished the chain. So what does that mean in terms of the framework? So for administrators out there, I'm wondering, is this policy enough? Is it an easy but important first step? Is it, and these are leading questions, I think, is it a legal hook for further cases or litigation for student affairs folks? Is it a way to get at some other questions about supporting student success around decolonization, around reconciliation? It also points to the limits of universities. Universities can do a lot, but universities are not in the business of ratifying treaties, right? And so I'll end with another very useful framing, which is a spectrum of indigenization in higher ed. So on one end, we have inclusion. On the other end, we have full decolonizing. And I would say the Jay Treaty might fall between those two things. It's a good first step, but it's not the end all be all. There's more that can be done. So the Jay Treaty, like all treaties, are sacred agreements intended to last as long as sun shines, grass grows, and the river flows. So my hope is that every school on Turtle Island adopts some version of a Jay Treaty policy, not just to benefit students who would be eligible, but to kickstart conversations and changes around better supporting Indigenous students and giving them the support that's long overdue. So I'm at time, but thank you so much for listening, everyone. Thanks to my generous hosts out west who made this presentation possible and allowed me to really expand on my research. I will take any questions now. And Marion has a hand up and a clap.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. This is really informative, and I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know. And just to reintroduce myself, I am the exchange programs manager at the Canadian Studies Center at the University of Washington. So we partner closely with Western on a lot of things. We are actually splitting funding with the Center for Canadian American Studies at Western. I, along with Todd Clark, who's on this call, am working on a small U.S. State Department grant to improve Indigenous student participation in study abroad. And we are specifically working with UBC on this, and recently took a group of Indigenous students from UW up to Vancouver. And the biggest challenge that we faced in this was getting students across the border and getting passports for them. We were completely unable to find, and I'm curious if you have any information on this, and I have our librarians working on this as we speak, but we were unable to find just a list of what tribes are recognized to cross the border under the Jay Treaty. So we ended up having to get passports for students that we're sure probably didn't need them, but we could not find any clear information on the US side in particular on how to cross the border, which obviously seems like a really big barrier to this as well, that students who might be able to qualify for these tuition waivers may have to apply for a passport to cross the border because this information isn't accessible. So I'm just curious what you came across in your research.
Sure. And Heather, could I tag you into this? I feel like you'd be a great resource here.
I was
And-
just going to suggest the same thing, Michael.
All right. So Heather, do you want to bring in the legal expertise on this, and I can add in any education stuff that I can?
Yeah. And apologies, I don't have my video set up. I've got my audio though. It wasn't working for like the first 3/4 of your presentation, but I'm all good now. And that was actually my major that issue, Marion, that you ran into is what I think a big takeaway is in all of this is that Canada, of course, these schools can adjust tuition status, Michael, as your work has highlighted, but that immigration status is really critical. And what we're coming up against is the fact that Canada does not reciprocate the Jay Treaty, period. So that's the big issue, and the real policy push that needs to happen here is for Canada to recognize the Jay Treaty in the way that United States does. There's a limited test that's used in Canada. There has been some movement in this respect. There was a major Supreme Court case in Canada that ultimately the Indigenous individual prevailed after many years, the Desautels case. This individual was a member of the Colville tribe. He asserted in the United States, but his specific tribe encompassed lands in Canada. His people, his ancestors originally lived forever on these lands in Canada, and he asserted their indigenous right to hunt and to fish in that region. As an American, he entered asserting his indigenous right to be there. He shot an elk. He didn't have a permit to do so. He said, I don't need a permit to do so. This is my right as an indigenous person under the Jay Treaty. Long story short, he did prevail after many layers of legal battle throughout the courts. But it's a limited test that they use. And essentially what Canada does is they say, is this right that the person is asserting a traditional activity that this specific band engaged in through time? And so in his specific case, yes, his people hunted elk in this land. But that doesn't translate well to modern activity where we're looking at students who want to enter Canada to go to school. In the United States with the Jay Treaty, Canadian individuals who qualify are able to enter for any purpose, to study, to work, to do whatever the heck they want to for as long as they want to. They don't have to present necessarily a passport. They do, of course, need to present qualifying documentation to show that they are eligible under the Jay Treaty. But Canada reciprocating in this way would really be key. On the passport point, it can be also an issue of sovereignty. We have individuals that take the position, hey, I don't want to present myself as a Canadian citizen, or on the US side, an American citizen. I want to present myself as a citizen of my Indigenous nation. And the Mohawk have been actually active on this point. They've pushed this, and there's some stories out there about that. I think actually with student groups, as I recall, I can find the story. It was a couple years ago now, but I think there was a group of Mohawk students that were trying to enter the United States and didn't want to have their Canadian passports. They wanted their Mohawk identification. So anyway, you've identified the issue there. It is an issue. As it stands, they would need to present WITI compliant documentation to enter Canada, or I think Canada does have, I'm a US immigration attorney, by the way, I don't practice on the Canadian side, but I think Canada does have some provisions in place for certain qualifying Indigenous individuals to present particular documents, like a status card.
Yeah, we had one student able to cross with
Mhm.
a card. Todd, do you know her tribal affiliation?
I don't remember. It was an East Coast tribe, though.
Yeah, because we were in talking with our study abroad colleagues, we kind of identified that one of the easiest and most useful ways that we could move our project forward is really to just have information on the study abroad website of, if you're an Indigenous student from blah, blah, XYZ tribes, you can cross the border without applying for a passport if you have this documentation. And we have been unable to find any kind of list that we can pull from. So that's been a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, when I first got here, and I think I heard of the Jay Treaty in that context, but I think it must be similar. We had a student who had been the chief of police at Lummi and was trained in our law program, and he was driving every day to Chilliwack to take his kids to I think mostly to an Indigenous school in Chilliwack. But I guess that wasn't Jay Treaty. That was like he could cross the border without, he wasn't using a passport, but he wasn't. I guess it wasn't the Jay Treaty.
And to go back to your question, Marion, is it Marion? Am I saying that right? Oh, good. My understanding, and Heather, correct me if I'm wrong, there wouldn't be a list necessarily, right, of who would be eligible. It would really be anyone who has 50% blood quantum, right? And they would explain that to the border crossing agent.
For the US side, I mean, if it were Canadian students entering the United States, on the Canadian side, though, it's going to be it's not going to be based on the bloodline. Canada just doesn't have that in place. What you'd be looking at is either asserting entry via a band or tribe that has a border crossing card in place. I think there's a few out there that actually do have their status cards also act as border crossing cards. And that's something that we've really pushed for, is the creation of like a Jay Treaty card that can be used, and then individuals could avoid needing to document themselves in other ways. So I think there are a few bands that do have border crossing cards that can act as a WITI compliant document. Otherwise, yeah, they would be looking at entering with a passport, or an Indigenous under the Indigenous provisions that Canada has set out. I could try to find on the Government of Canada's website some kind of applicable list. They're pretty good. I feel like their website is at least better than our various US agencies in setting out entry documentation. So I could try to look for that.
Thank you. Quick follow-up, and I don't want to take up all the question time because I'm sure Todd and other people have questions, but just a quick follow-up. I'm wondering if one of the things that's being advocated for in relation to these tuition waivers could also be, or is, funding for students to get passports.
Right. And that wouldn't necessarily circumvent or upstage the federal government's jurisdiction over immigration, but it will be a way to improve student mobility. Yeah, that's interesting. I had a really good chat with the folks at Western Washington when I was out there. And they said part of the push that would effectively create a Jay Treaty tuition-like arrangement, but may not mention the Jay Treaty, would be to remove the residency requirements that are currently in place for you to access the in-state tuition rate at University of Washington if you're an Indigenous person. So I believe right now you have to reside in Washington or Idaho, and there's maybe a couple other bordering states. But if they lifted that requirement, right, that would apply then to students who are living on the Canadian side. So there's also some other ways to get at some of these cross-border tuition waivers without maybe passing something that's explicitly, Jay Treaty related. But I like that idea. Right. And our host Neil has his hand up.
Michael, thank you. Thanks for a lovely talk, and thanks for bringing it in at 12:21, so we've got time to chat. So I guess you sort of were getting at this at the end, and there was some of those lovely quotes that you sped by, but there's this question of, it's interesting, given that the Canadian Supreme Court has, if it last rejected the Jay Treaty in 2001, right? Is that what you said? And you sort of got at the motivation of university administrators, whether they're registrars or presidents, that they might want to, but if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of political sociology, it's interesting to me that these universities are making Jay Treaty centered demands or policies. And most of those are explicitly acknowledging the Jay Treaty, notwithstanding the fact that the Canadian government refuses to recognize. So what's that state society politics tussle like? Because these are public universities that are state, funded by the Canadian federal government, I believe. So why is it that they're willing to some way, confront public policy, official national policy, or at least, question it in this kind of in Jay Treaty terms at the moment?
Wow. I can always count on you to ask a thoughtful, tough question. There's a lot in that question, and I'll try and get it one or two of the nuggets in there. This question came up when I was giving a talk out at Western Washington last month, and a student asked, well, as you're kind of pointing out, couldn't the Canadian government come in and say, well, why are you recognizing this Jay Treaty? It's not your business to be recognizing a treaty, right? This is up to the federal government. So couldn't this run afoul of the Canadian state, And I think in an earlier era, it would have. But I think the way the winds are moving, there's positive public pressure around what I would call Indigenous inclusion, right? Maybe not full decolonization, but something like this, where a university is saying, well, we're doing this for Indigenous students, or we're announcing this initiative. Maybe it's substantive, maybe it's PR, could be either one. But I think there is appetite in, we'll call it settler Canadian society, for this kind of thing. So talking about political sociology, I think there is context and support for this kind of policy. I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, there could be some pushback from Ottawa. But, you know, there was a document put out by the Canadian Senate a few years back about on the subject of border crossings and the, you know, illegal challenges to First Nations border crossing. And you know what the first recommendation of that report was? It was to Canada to implement some version of the Jay Treaty. So even though schools, again, don't have control over immigration, I think there's this sort of national appetite for something like this. Maybe not a policy that goes further, but something up to that. Did that get at your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
And what interests me is sort of the internal governance, right? Like, how does this thing come to be discussed or debated in the Board of Governors, you know? And what's interesting, I thought there'd be tons of back and forth in the board meetings. I got the meeting notes, but at VIU, it's 10 minutes. It's a unanimous vote. So there was a lot of, I think, agenda setting. I think that's the term you would use in policy studies, right? Jennifer, you're nodding, of agenda setting in terms of getting everyone on the same page so that when the vote came, it was straightforward. That said, this vote didn't happen in 1960, not in 1970, not in 1990. It happened this year, I think, for a reason. Public pressure can do wonders for policy change. Amen. And Marion has a follow-up.
Yes, I do have a follow-up. So we, like I said, we were recently up at UBC with students and we met with folks there that are part of the Longhouse and, you know, part of the Indigenous community at UBC and with Todd, who I wish he was still here to talk to this because he really has a lot more background in this particular topic than I do. But we kind of realized in talking to them that UBC is about 3 decades ahead of where the University of Washington is in terms of its commitment to indigenizing campus and putting Indigenous priorities in their strategic plans. I mean, they have an actual Indigenous strategic plan that UW doesn't have. And one of the differences that we realized in talking to them is UBC sits on Musqueam land, and Musqueam itself is very well organized and very strong in advocating. The University of Washington sits on a lot of different territory, and one of our major tribes that we work with, the Duwamish, are not federally recognized, and it makes it a lot harder for the tribes to come together in terms of advocacy to push for certain things at the University of Washington. And I'm wondering if you've seen that in other places that you studied, that there's a really, like, particularly maybe looking at these 2 universities, if there's a correlation between the strength of the tribal, you know, advocacy in relation to how quickly these things get passed.
That's a great question. And I'm going to be an academic here and answer a related question that comes to mind that'll hopefully get back to your question, which is that in my interviews with Indigenous administrators, I was reminded, and it's self-evident, but sometimes I forget, is that Indigenous opinions are not going to be the same, right? They're not a monolith, right? And so, in fact, in University of Saskatchewan, there was some concern from a local First Nation that bringing in Indigenous students from a different territory, different Indigenous group, might displace local Cree students, right? So there's that element as well, that not all local First Nations might be happy, or one might be happy, another one might not be happy. And just to add another layer to this, some of the push for the Jay Treaty policy at University of Saskatchewan came from Indigenous students from Hawaii who were seeking a tuition adjustment, right? So I don't know to what extent the push from the Jay Treaty policy came from a local First Nation versus an Indigenous staff at the university who might not be from a local First Nation, from a different First Nation. So I think, yeah, to your point, there's a lot that has to do with the participation and feelings of the local First Nation, not just, you know, an Indigenous person who is affiliated with the university, you know. So I did not answer your question. I recognize that. But that's a great question for follow-up. Thanks. Good to know.
Does anyone have a final question or two? We have about we've up about 8 minutes. We can keep chatting or.
I just will add and plug really quickly that Michael is going to be writing a border policy brief for us for spring quarter. So you can look forward to seeing that come out sometime in the next few months.
Yeah, and I think that would be a fantastic resource for our law, diversity, and justice courses here at Fairhaven.
We do have some older J Treaty border briefs from way back in the day that were done by Greg Bowes. And Heather, I know that you did background work for that. I'm not sure if you're credited, but I know you had a lot of impact on that. But that's a great resource for more of a background on the document as well and on the treaty.
Yeah, on that one, just a quick note. Yeah, I think the first one I was still in law school at the time. And then the subsequent versions of the paper I was an author on. But a quick note, that original BPRI brief is slightly outdated now in terms of the process for applying at the border. So I give people that caveat, and we're actually working on an update to the paper with Michael as well. I'm going to be a co-author, so look for that in the coming months.
Thanks for that opportunity to work with you. Another collaboration which I'll plug is a translation of, speaking of briefs, an earlier brief at BIG, the Borders and Globalization, that we've translated into Cree. So one of many Indigenous languages, but we chose Cree because it is one of the most commonly spoken Indigenous languages, and it's one of the languages spoken around the University of Saskatchewan. So I would say in about 48 hours, I don't want to tempt fate, but that brief should be up on the University of Victoria website. I actually have a question for Marion. So I used to work in international ed. I think it still haunts me sometimes in my dreams. But are any Indigenous students from the other side of the border coming down to you on J1 visas?
So we have an existing exchange program between UW, UBC, and UVic. And none of the Canadian students that I am aware of who have come to us have been Indigenous, and Canadian students do not need a J1 visa to come on exchange to the US, which makes the process much easier. So no, to my knowledge, no.
Okay, yeah. The one question, and this is probably for a international education lawyer, but how a J Treaty status could intersect with or affect like an F1 status or these other kind of international education statuses in the US, you know?
Yeah, it might be more relevant to a graduate student who's here for longer.
Okay.
Because the undergrads who come, you know, they're here for a couple of quarters or maybe a full academic year, but not long enough usually to, and they go home usually over the holidays, so they're not usually here long enough to warrant anything more than just crossing as a Canadian citizen.
Got you. Got it. Cool. Right, because as you point out, the other scenario is you want to reside in the US, right? And the J Treaty would allow you to reside as well and to work, right? And to get around some of those restrictions around working that being a student would be. But
we, in this study abroad project that we're working on, we ultimately do hope to make it a reciprocal thing. So, you know, this is interesting stuff to take forward in our conversations with UBC in terms of their students coming to us. We've been focusing, because this is US funded, federally funded through the US government, we're focusing on American students. And I think, I don't know the Canadian stats, but I think that it might not be quite as bad on the Canadian side in terms of Indigenous student participation in going abroad as it is in the US, where it's 0.5% and has stayed that way for decades. So, it'll be interesting to see in the next year or two as we move forward, kind of what it looks like working with getting the Canadian students down here and how that changes the project.
Sure. I know, and maybe this is part of what you're doing, but one of my contacts at UVic was talking about the canoe journeys that they do every year.
Todd is involved with that, so I'm sure we should set up more of a conversation with you and Todd. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I put my email in there if you do want to follow up. But one idea one administrator had is, well, why don't we at least mention the Jade Treaty when we do these canoe journeys? If we want to tease the idea of studying at a Canadian institution, right? They could get a tuition break.
This is so wonderful. It's such a nice discussion. It's very intimate, but it's really inspiring research. And I would like, as well as thanking Michael, I'd really like to thank Laurie and Jennifer and the Border Policy Research Institute. It's been wonderful to collaborate with you over all these years, and it's been fantastic this year with your 2 border fellows. Thank you, and Michael, thank you so much. Good luck with finishing the PhD, and good luck with the changes in your family that are imminent. And we hope you'll visit us again.
I can't wait. And I'm so glad that we were able to have an academic conversation, but also apply some of this research to policy. That's where I love that intersection.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, Michael.
All right. Well, please stay in
Thank
touch.
you.
Thank you all. So good to see you all. And thanks for being present and engaged. Talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.